Sipping Ground Coffee, our summer series of live streaming broadcasts. My name's Dan Painter, and along with this team here at Flint & Walling, we'll be hosting today's topic. There's a myriad of topics that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of months. And the marketing team here at Flint & Walling has come up with a pretty good idea. This is how it works. Each one of these sessions that will be conducted, and there's 36 of them between, again, now and the end of August, there'll be a code word given out. I'll give you a code word during the course of the presentation. If you email that code word back to Flint & Walling at marketing@flintandwalling.com. So send that code word to marketing@flintandwalling.com. As soon as you collect, or as soon as we collect 3 of them, different sessions, then I think Flint & Walling is going to provide some kind of a reward for you. But anyway, let's go ahead and get started with today's topic. Today is Irrigation Pumps 101. Unlike the submersible pump counterparts, what we're going to be talking about today are above ground pumps. Some people refer to these as surface pumps. They all have air-cooled motors, so you get the gist. These are all going to be installed above ground. Now, when it comes to irrigation, there's 2 types of pumps that are commonly sold into irrigation. The first one up here is what we call jet pumps, right? They've been around for a long, long time. If you had a house in the country back in the 50s, you had a well, you probably had a jet pump. So they've been around for a long time. And then the second category of pumps that we'll get into are what we call centrifugal pumps. You're going to hear me say 2 types a couple times today at least. So that said, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about jet pumps. Again, they're used for irrigation oftentimes, but when you look at a jet pump, all right, and let's talk about wells just for a second. The depth to the water in a well was very, very important with the jet pump. So, for example, this well on the left-hand side, okay, if that water level from the surface down to the water level in that well, if that's 25 feet or less, and this is an industry standard, this is not an F&W, we didn't come up with this, but the industry will call that well a shallow well. 25 feet or less down to that water level. And then, of course, if that water level is beyond that, more than 25 feet, the industry calls that a deep well. Not really important today when it comes to submersible pumps, but it was very, very important back in the day as it pertained to jet pumps. And so knowing whether you had a shallow well or a deep well was important to decide which pump to select. And by the way, when we're done with this presentation, my goal here is to provide you with enough information that you can just visually look at a pump and know what type of pump it is. You don't have to look at the model number. You don't have to resort to a catalog. Just a quick visual inspection of that pump ought to tell you what that is. Anyway, back to this. 25 feet or less is called a shallow well, and all these above ground pumps need to operate on 25 feet or less, all right? So the reason that was important to know shallow well from deep well is 2 types of jet pumps are offered. Before we get into the 2 types, I'm going to tell you, why are they even called jet pumps? You know, I've been asked that several times. Why do they call a jet pump a jet pump? And, you know, I asked that question in a classroom one day, and I had a guy in the very back row of the class raise his hand up, and I said, "Yes, sir, why do you think they call a jet pump a jet pump?" And he said to me, "You ever hear one run?" And I'm thinking, whoa, gee, wasn't expecting that, but yes, I've heard one run several hundred times. Why? Why would you say that? He goes, "Well, they sound like a daggone jet." And I'm thinking, dude, you're not talking about an F&W brand, because we balance impellers, we balance rotors. Flint & Walling is going to make one of the quietest pumps that, in the industry, all right? I don't believe that to be the reason why they call them jet pumps. And the reason that I do believe they call them jet pumps is a bit of an opinion, and that is because a jet pump has to have a jet accompany it. So you can't just take the pump out. You got to take the pump with a jet, and those jets are pictured on the right-hand side of your screen. Some of the old-timers used to call these things ejectors. But there's 2 types of jets that will go with these pumps. One is a shallow well jet, And again, if you look at that shallow well jet and then look at that pump just adjacent, that shallow well jet bolts right up to the front of that pump, all right, shallow well jet. And then there's the deep well jet. If you look at the pump associated with that deep well jet, you'll see there are two ports coming out the front of that pump. And that at the top, that shallow well jet bolts right up to those two ports. But in the case of a deep well jet, those two ports are going to have two lines run to the water source. I'm going to show you this in a little bit. You have two lines that will run to the water source. But again, these all have jets, all right? If we want to know how they work, how does a jet pump work? Pretty easy to describe this. Every one of us have done this sometime in our life. We've held a length of garden hose with the hose bib fully open, and we can watch that water roll out the end of that garden hose. Sometimes it'll go out there 6, 8 feet or more, depending on how much pressure they've got, right? That was my, that was my primary source of drinking water when I was growing up. We've also done this, right? I think all of us have done this, put our thumb over the end of that garden hose, and when we do that, we get a change, don't we? Instead of that water just rolling out there 6 or 8 feet, man, you can shoot that water, 30, 40 feet out there. By restricting the opening in that garden hose, you have increased the velocity of that water coming out of it, right? So that's what happens when we restrict the opening. We increase that velocity. And that velocity is going to be key word here, because velocity will ultimately result in suction. And I want to show you how that works. I did a science fair project many years ago. I can't remember if it was my son or daughter, but let me just describe this to you real quick. We took a piece of 3/4 inch copper tubing, I don't know, maybe a foot long, and I pressed a nozzle inside of that copper tubing because I wanted to mimic holding your thumb over the end of that garden hose, all right? I want to restrict that opening coming through that copper tubing. And then I drilled a hole and soldered a small piece of tubing into that hole. So it created a little bit of a Y, as you can see on the screen. Soldered up a hose bib fitting, and we took this thing out back in the backyard, and we hooked the garden hose up to it. All right, so we're holding this in our hand. We've got the garden hose hooked up to it. We turn the garden hose on, and here comes that water. It comes into that copper tubing until it gets to that nozzle. Now, once it gets to that nozzle, it's the same thing really as holding your thumb over the end of that garden hose. We've increased a lot of velocity, right? We're shooting that water out there, 30, 40 feet. And again, I can't remember if it was my son or daughter, but I asked him, I said, I want you to put your finger over the end of that little tube that we've got up there. Do you notice anything up there? And oh my gosh, yes. What do you notice? Well, it feels like that wants to suck my finger right down into that tube. Yep, that's exactly what we were looking for, because that velocity creates a pulling effect behind it, which is kind of like suction. I'll give you another example. Maybe it's a little archaic, but if you're running down a highway and you've got all the windows rolled up in a car and somebody fires up a cigarette, it doesn't take 2 or 3 puffs out of that thing, and that whole compartment of that car is going to be filled with smoke. Now, if you're running down a highway and you don't even have to roll that window down, just crack it a little bit and see what happens to that smoke. We all know what happens. It gets drawn out, it gets pulled out through that small, tiny opening in that window. It's because of the velocity of that air moving past that opening in that window that creates that pulling effect, that suction effect that allows us to pull water out of a well or out of a cistern. Because if we look at these jets, and again, up there on the screens, your shallow well jet along with a deep well jet, they both have nozzles in them. And for the same purpose we just discussed, we want those nozzles to create velocity so that we also can have suction in behind it. Here's what a lot of people don't know about jet pumps, all right? A lot of people don't realize this. Of course, we bring water in and pump it out to the discharge, whether that's going to a home or an irrigation system, what have you. But what a lot of people don't know is a portion of the water that pump is going to pump is coming out that bottom opening in the front of that pump where you see those 2 ports. It's coming out that bottom opening. And it's called drive water. And the purpose of that drive water is to make a U-turn inside that jet and go through that nozzle. Because we know that when we go through that nozzle, we create suction because of all the velocity that's been attributed to that. So if if I had somebody come up to me and say, hey, painter, I got a jet pump, and that thing's, it's not putting out much water. In fact, that's not hardly pumping at all. What do you think might be wrong? Well, the first thing I would recommend is check that nozzle out, right? There's a clean-out plug in the front of that jet. You can see it up there on your screen. There's a clean-out plug in the front of that so that can be removed. And if anything gets lodged in that nozzle, if that nozzle is plugged or partially plugged, let's look at it. You're not going to get the velocity that you were looking for. And if you don't get that velocity, you're not going to get suction. And obviously, if you don't get suction, guess what? There's no water going to your, the house or the irrigation system. The pump's not pumping very much. So that's there to take that plug out with a piece of copper wire. You can go in and perhaps dislodge anything that might have gotten into that nozzle. That'd be the first place I'd check, though, because that is so critical to a jet pump that nozzle remains clean and clear so that it can function as it's supposed to. With the deep well jet pump, now the shallow well that jet bolts right up to the front of the pump. But with the deep well jet pump, that jet, it's going to be mounted vertically and it's going to go down in the well. That's where the suction is created. So we've got to get that device closer to where that water source is at. So in the case of a deep well jet pump, that bottom port that was the drive water for a shallow well jet will also be the drive water for a deep well jet, but we have to pipe it down to that jet. All right, so we've got to run a pipe from that pump down to that jet assembly. Once that water enters there, it's going to make that U-turn just like we talked about, create that suction so that we can pull water, from a depth further down than that 20, 25 feet we talked about earlier. And then there'll be a second pipe that's going to carry the water back up to the pump. So here's your visual. A shallow well pump. We talked about it being on applications of 25 feet or less. That water level in the well is called a static water level. So we also talked about it being a single pipe system, all right? There's only one pipe running to the well. With a deep well jet, there'll be two pipes running to the well. So, if I had two jet pumps sitting here on the table in front of me, and I wanted to determine which one is which, I'm going to look at the front of the pump. If there's only one pipe that's going to run to the water source, that's shallow well. If I got two openings there, then I know I'm going to be running a deep well. Irrespective of shallow well, deep well, all above ground or surface pumps pulling water out of wells or cisterns or lakes, what have you, they have to have a foot valve on the bottom of that suction pipe, all right? That foot valve acts like a check valve. It's only going to allow water to go through in one direction only. There is a screen wrapped around the base of that foot valve to keep out any large particulate or particles that could possibly get into the pump, or particularly in this case, into those nozzles. So you got a screen on that foot valve, but it will, again, only allow water to go through in one direction. When the pump shuts off, it'll hold that water right there in that pipe. Will not allow it to come back out. All right, now, in the spirit of full disclosure, when we talk about deep well jet pumps, all right, this is not pertaining to shallow well, but particularly deep well jet pumps. These pumps were referred to as convertible pumps, all right, convertible pumps. A lot of customers still buy these because they can stock one pump and two jets, and they've got both applications covered. So if they take the pump and send it out with a shallow well jet, they've just created a shallow well jet pump. If they take that same pump and add a deep well jet to it and send it out, now they've created a deep well jet. That's why these are called convertible pumps, and suppliers really liked that back in the day because they could stock one pump and two jets, and it just helped with inventory. Now, that pump that's down at the bottom, and these are very popular, right? I probably should have made this the bigger image. These are very, very popular in the jet pump industry. This is what's called a straight-up shallow well jet pump. What do you mean? That pump's never going to be used for deep well. Why is that? Well, look at this shallow well jet assembly. It's actually a part of the casting. So it's an integral part of that pump casting. That jet's not able to be taken off and put back on. So that particular pump is only going to be used for shallow well applications, shallow well only. Very, very popular pump. All right, when we look at the pumps, though, again, just to separate shallow well from deep well, shallow well pumps are going to operate when the water is 25 feet or less from the pump. That's just a vertical distance only. I don't care about horizontal, just vertical distance only. And it's also referred to as a single pipe, all right, a single pipe system, because there's only one pipe running to the water source. That water source, by the way, that's what's called a static water level. Static water level is the water level in a well under non-pumping, undisturbed conditions, all right? So the well's set idle for a period of time. You put a tape measure down there, and you figure out how far is it down to that water level. That's what we're going to call, that's where that 25 feet is going to come into play. That's what we also call lift, all right? So these above ground pumps, they have to lift water many times and then pump it. And I had a guy call me out in class one day. He said, "Wait a minute, Painter, you said you're stopping right up there at that water level." I said, "Yes, sir, that's where I'm stopping. That's the only place I'm going to measure from there up." He goes, "But I got a foot valve down below that. It could be, it could be several feet below that water level, and that foot valve, as you already discussed, is where the water comes in. And so why aren't you measuring from the foot valve all the way up to that suction port instead of just the water level?" I think most of you probably understand why we only have to go down to the water level, but I took a glass of water and I filled it to the top and I dropped a straw in it and I set it on the table in front of this guy. And I said, "I got a question for you." He said, "What's that?" I said, "Where's that water level inside that straw?" He goes, "Well, that's easy." I said, "Where is it?" He said, "It's at the same level it is in the glass." I said, "You're absolutely right, sir." So when you drop that drop pipe off that shallow well or deep well, when you put those pipes down in that well, think of it as that straw. That water's going to come through that foot valve. It's going to come up that suction pipe to the level it is in the well, that static water level. So therefore, when you put your mouth on that straw and you start to pull that water out of that glass, it's already 3/4 the way up, right? So you're only having to lift it just a little bit. So that's why we stop right there at the water level. Now, the deep well jet, this is more than 25 feet application, more than 25 feet, and this is conservative. A deep well jet that we manufacture here at F&W can pretty easily pull and lift water from a depth even as far down as 90 feet. And that, like I said, is conservative. But a deep well jet pump is also referred to as a two-pipe system. So there's your visual between jet pumps. Shallow well, 25 feet or less, single pipe system. Deep well, more than 25 feet, two-pipe system. All right? Now, if by chance, and I'm only going to spend just a little bit of time here, but if by chance you're using a jet pump just for a home application, all right? Just for a home application and perhaps also irrigation, but for a house, how much water is that house going to need? That's a question. That can be used on a lot of different pump sizing applications. How much water does this house need? Well, there's this fixture count method that's been out there, man, that's been out there for decades. And basically what it's equating to is the total number of fixtures in the house, right? The total number of fixtures in the house ought to equal the pumping rate, gallons per minute pumping rate of the pump. So let's look at this house for a second. Let's count these fixtures. Down there in that kitchen, I have a sink and a dishwasher. So that's 2 fixtures. I'm going to put 2 over there. I've got a laundry room, and there's a clothes washer in that laundry room. So there's another fixture. Upstairs, there's a full bath. So there's a tub, shower, a lav, and a toilet. There's 3 more. Downstairs is a half bath, toilet, and a lav. There's 2 more. And the other thing, so you see where we're going with this. We're just counting fixtures, right? Also want to include outside hose bibs. In this case, there's 1. I don't care about coffee makers, ice makers, those little piddly devices. I don't care about those, but I do want to consider water-using appliances such as dishwashers and clothes washers. But I'm going to add all these fixtures up, and when I do, I'm coming up with a total of 9 fixtures in this little house. So then what does that mean? Well, if we look at the fixture count method, it means that the total number of fixtures ought to represent the gallon per minute rating of the pump. So very quickly, we now determined that the flow rate for that house, we need to have a pump that's going to put out at least 9 gallons a minute, right? Very easy there. All right, that's enough on jet pumps. We're going to go to really the more popular pumps that are used in irrigation, and these are referred to as centrifugal pumps. And centrifugal pumps, believe it or not, there are 2 types of centrifugal pumps, all right? On the left-hand side is what's called a straight centrifugal. And Renee, you're ready for me on that right-hand side here, folks, is your code word for the day. Your code word for the day is self-priming, all right? So self-priming will be the code word for today's session. But that's what they're going to call that pump over there on that right-hand side, is a self-priming. Sometimes they refer to that as a lawn sprinkling pump, all right? Sometimes they refer to it as a lawn sprinkling pump. But again, these are referred to as centrifugal pumps, and if we look at centrifugal pumps, they're very easy to explain because they operate off a centrifugal force, all right? They can also use a variety of water sources. Unlike, submersibles are typically cisterns or wells or lakes, but with a centrifugal pump, the water source can come from wells. It can actually be municipal water, city water. There's a lot of these sold, centrifugal pumps on city water supplies just to act as a booster pump. These pumps work on underground tanks or cisterns, sometimes they're referred to. Just keep in mind that anything underground like that, a tank, a cistern, or underground storage tank like that, that water is not going to be potable. If that's ground surface water that's getting in there, even if it's rainwater, that's not a potable water source. So that would be used for irrigation only. Above ground tanks, we've got places up in the Northeast that the wells are very, they don't produce a lot of water, 2-3 gallons a minute. Well, what are you going to do with that? Well, you're going to bring it above ground and store it in a big tank. And then you've got to repressurize it. So these pumps are used for above ground tanks. They are also used for any number of surface water applications, right? All right, let's go back to this centrifugal force. That's what pushes everything to the outside. You're on a YouTube channel right now. Maybe when we're all done, just type in motorcycle and merry-go-round in your search. You're going to get some other videos. And, you'll get a chuckle out of it when these strapping young men discover centrifugal force in a very, very personal way. Motorcycle, merry-go-round, type them in. But that same thing happens with the impeller that's in a pump, right? That impeller is hooked to a motor shaft, so the impeller is turning at the same rate the motor's spinning at 3,450 RPMs, and it's going to throw everything to the outside, right? Hurricanes, we see these on TV all the time, and as they intensify and they get stronger in strength, you'll see the cloud formation move further and further and further away from that center spot there, that center spot that you see. That will happen as that intensifies. And that center dot, I've asked this in classroom, and I say, hey, anybody know what that center dot is? Yeah, what is that? That's called an eye. You're absolutely right. That's the eye of the hurricane. Just like our impellers also have an eye. And when we start shoving water into the eye of that impeller, right, that center portion right there, and that impeller spinning at 3,450 RPMs, all that water is going to be slung to the outside through those veins that are cut into that impeller, right? This is probably one of the most simplest pumps we manufacture, because when we put this whole thing in a pump body, it's very efficient, very, very efficient to move water through that pump, through a centrifugal pump. It just moves right on through. Speaking of these impellers, you do have a choice when it comes to centrifugals. You have a choice between a thermal injection molded plastic impeller, which we own the thermal injection molders. They're located in southern Indiana. They're all part of our family here. And the other choice is a no-lead brass impeller, right? So those are your two choices that you have for centrifugal pumps. If you do choose a brass impeller, know that we balance those 100% in-house, all right? We balance those 100%. The plastic injection molded, they're so precise, they come in, they're balanced already. But we do have to balance all the brass impellers. When also talking about impellers, the more impellers that you put in a pump, now these centrifugal pumps, that you can have more than one impeller, all right? Jet pumps are only going to have one impeller, but centrifugals, you can have, up to 3 impellers. These are referred to as stages. They're referred to as stages. And, I had a guy come up to me after a class one day. He said, I learned something today. I appreciate it. I said, what's that? He said, I didn't know they called impellers stages. He said, I got these pumps back in my warehouse. He said, some of them say 2-stage, some of them say single stage, some of them say multiple. I didn't know what they were talking about, and now I do. He said, so, yes, so they're oftentimes referred to as stages. But why do we need so many different options here? We got single stage, 2 and 3 stage. Why would we need more stages? Well, if you look at the top, more impellers are going to create more pressure, right? So what happens if you've got a pump that sits way down here at the bottom of this hill? And you've got to get that water all the way to the top of that hill in order to satisfy that irrigation zone that's up there. Well, you know, depending on how far that's up there, that's going to take some pressure to get the water up there. And the way we overcome that is we add impellers to the pump, all right? We add impellers to the pump. So in my opinion, the multi-stage or, multi-stage centrifugal pumps are going to be used in areas where there's a lot of terrain change or there's elevation they have to overcome. That's typically where you're going to see a lot of these multi-stage pumps sold. Here in Northeast Indiana, where we all reside, we don't have elevation. We're flat as a daggone pancake. I'll tell you how flat we are. I had a dog run away when I was 9 years old. He ran away from home. 3 days later, I could still look out there and see him. I mean, that's how flat we are. So there again, with no elevation, no terrain changes, here in Indiana, a lot of pumps are sold and are almost all single-stage pumps. All right, here's a cutaway of a 3-stage pump. I actually had this pump sitting on a table at a show one day at kind of like an open house. And when they let the contractors come in, I had a contractor walk up to my table where I had that pump sitting on the table. And when he looked at it, I thought this dude was going to wet his pants, man. I mean, I never saw anybody get so daggone excited over a pump. I don't see a lot of glamour when I look at that thing, but he did. And he pointed at those impellers. And he said, man, those are made out of brass, as if, maybe I didn't know that. And I said, yes, sir. I said, actually, you have a choice when it comes to impellers in that pump, sir. You can get the thermal injection molded plastic, or you can get these no-lead brass impellers. He goes, man, these brass impellers are going to solve a problem I'm having. I said, well, what kind of problem are you having? He said, there's a lake north of us, and he said, all around that lake I have pumps. They're not yours, but I have centrifugal pumps, and they're pulling water out of that lake for irrigation purposes. And he goes, every season, and I'm assuming he meant every year, he goes, every season I got to go out and I got to replace all those impellers. I go, what? He goes, yeah, I got to replace it. He goes, there's been times I've had to go out twice on the same pump in the same season to replace these plastic impellers. I go, dude, what's going on there? He said, they're in shreds. I take that pump apart. He goes, those impellers are just in shreds. And I looked at him. I said, something's causing that. He goes, well, I know what's causing it. And I said, well, you want to share that with me? He said, sure. Shells. I said, like seashells? He goes, absolutely. He said, those shells are getting inside that pump. He said, when that pump powers up, those impellers initially, they break those shells all into pieces. He goes, but when that happens, they become very, very abrasive. It's almost like sandblasting these impellers. And he goes, they just chew them all to pieces. I reckon those brass impellers won't do that, will they? That's what he asked me. Oh, shoot, I don't know. We've never tested this pump for shells. I'll tell you what we have done. We've deadheaded that pump for 30 minutes, and we'll do that 3 times, and there's not another pump out there that'll go through that kind of destructive test. We've ran that pump dry for 4 hours, and I can tell you this, there's not another pump out there that'll do that either. Some of them don't even make it an hour. But I said to him, sir, I don't never remember us running any shells through a pump, so if you're asking me if this is going to be a better mousetrap, I'm not going to take that gamble. But I will tell you this: if I had your track record, I would take the gamble if I were you. If I had your track record, I'd make that change. Well, a year later, I'm at that same show. Here he comes, a whole different strut this time, strutting back and forth. Walks up, big old smile on his face. He goes, "You remember me?" Absolutely, I remember you, sir. Not only do I remember you, I remember your story. You told me you were the one that had the shells and the impellers going to pieces on you. Yep, he said, that's me. I go, what'd you ever do? He said, I put your pumps in. I said, I'm going to assume you put them in with the brass impellers. He said, absolutely. I said, so is there a verdict? He goes, yeah, I haven't had to go out on any of them. Boom. He said, I think we got that problem fixed. So there are times, I suppose, plastic or brass impellers have some advantages over plastic. However, performance is very comparable. Lifespan is very, very comparable. But these centrifugal pumps, when we talk about these are very, very simple pumps. You have an impeller that spins on a motor shaft, really. That's the extent of it. When we look at these pumps, though, when you install any of these above-ground pumps, we need to make sure that they get primed before they can be put into operation. All above-ground pumps are going to need to be primed, all right? So that's going to bring us to this code word self-primer. But anyway, you know, why do they call does self-priming pumps need to be primed initially? Yes. All pumps, and a young kid learned that all means all, and that's all means, all right? So all pumps need to be primed initially in order to pump water, and that includes the self-priming pump, all right? So let's look at why they do call this a self-priming, all right? Why is this called a self-priming pump? Well, here are both the centrifugal pumps up on the screen again. That straight centrifugal over on the left-hand side, if that's installed on an irrigation system, and let's suppose that irrigation system develops a leak, and that's not uncommon. And overnight, that system drains down completely, and there is absolutely zero pressure in those water lines now, all right? If you look at that pump on that screen there, I suppose it's possible that water could drain down all the way to the bottom side of that suction port, that inlet port, down there where that yellow hash line's at. It's not going to drain below that. There's no way for it to get out unless you took that drain plug down at the bottom, very bottom. If you took that drain plug out, then you'd get the rest of that water out of there. But in the case of a straight centrifugal, it's possible that it could drain down that far. Well, look what happens now. The impeller's not submerged in water. These impellers are not like fan blades. They can't move air. They can only move a liquid. So, you know, in our case, that's always going to be water. But with this pump here, this straight centrifugal, if you've had this happen, you're going to have to go out, locate that leak, fix it, repair it, and then you're going to have to reprime your straight centrifugal pump to get that impeller fully submerged in water again before that thing will start pumping for you. All right? Now let's look at the same situation, same scenario, only this time we've got a self-priming pump installed, all right? Same thing happens. There's a leak, everything drains down to zero, water starts draining out of the pump, but in the case of a self-primer, that little yellow hash line is the farthest that water can drain out of there, right? It can only go down to the bottom of that suction port, which means that impeller is still fully submerged in water. There is why it gets its name self-priming. In this case, you go out, you find the leak, you fix it, and you power the pump back up because the pump's already primed. The impeller's already fully submerged in water. But there's your visual for the centrifugal pumps, right? A straight centrifugal pump's going to have an inlet that comes right down dead center. I think the reason they call that a straight centrifugal is the water coming from the water source goes straight into the eye of that impeller. Whereas the self-primer, look where that suction port of that inlet's at. It's way high, right? It's up there where the discharge is located. So there's your visuals. If I had 4 pumps sitting in here today, I would hope that you could look at all 4 of these pumps and be able to tell which one's a shallow well, a deep well, a straight centrifugal, or a self-primer simply through a visual inspection. Now, I want to talk about priming just a little bit. This is very, very important. You need to take a measure of patience when priming a pump. You really do. And I'm going to explain that why here in just a second. We're coming down to our last few slides here. There are going to be some pumps, in addition to the suction and the discharge. There are going to be some surface pumps or above ground pumps that will have what we call a dedicated priming port. It's going to be an additional port at the top of that pump, and it's going to have a pipe plug put in it, all right? That's what's referred to as a priming port. And so in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to remove that plug, and we're going to put a funnel in there so we can prime that pump up, all right? That makes it very, very easy to prime a pump when you have that priming port up there, or that priming port up there. But there's a lot of pumps, and these centrifugals are one of them. There's no priming port at the top of these pumps. You've got a suction in the front and a discharge out the top. So I strongly recommend that anytime you install a centrifugal pump or a surface pump that doesn't have a priming port, make one. And how do you do that? You just incorporate a T on the discharge side of that and put a plug in the top of it. There you go. Now you got a priming port, right? And that's not too difficult to do. But you know, if it down the road, if something occurs and this pump's going to need to be reprimed and you get the phone call and you got to be the one to go out there and reprime it, why not make it a little easy on yourself when you install it to begin with, right? Go ahead and put that T in there. That keeps you from having to cut the lines and then recouple them back together. If you have that T there, you can take that plug out, and right there you've just created your priming port. All right, so that's strongly recommended as the addition of a T on the discharge. When we talk about priming pumps, and again, take a measure of patience, because it's just not just the pump body that we want to fill with water. We want to make sure that that entire suction line running out wherever that's going, you know, if that's going into a lake or a well or a cistern, wherever, we want to make sure that we get all the air bubbles out of that, that suction line and that pump body. And by the way, if you look, I'm going to go back one slide here. If you look at that pump body and you see that suction port right there in the dead center, right on top of that suction port, if I had a laser pointer, I could point this out, but right on top of that suction port is another plug up there, right? Not the drain plug at the bottom, but that plug on top of that suction port. That's called a priming plug. And our jet pumps have them, our centrifugal pumps have them, and the reason they're there is to remove when you're priming the pump. You'll find that if you take that priming plug out, you'll find that pump will have will prime a lot quicker, a lot more efficient, because there's a place pretty readily for that air to escape. But we want to make sure we get all that air out of that suction line and that pump body. All right. So air pockets and bubbles must be eliminated. And here's the best bullet on that. Look at that. Failure to prime a pump or for the pump to keep its prime is the #1 cause for initial pump failure. And that can be resolved with patience, right? With patience. Well, that's bringing us back to about 12:43, so we're going to come to an end with this one. You've got the secret word, which is self-priming. I also want to point out that we'd love you to subscribe to our newsletter for updates, to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Follow Flint & Walling on social media. I'm telling you, they do a fantastic job there, very entertaining, very informative. Go to our website and register for our newsletter. This will keep you up to date on just all the things going on. We have, if you go to the website and you go to the literature section, there's brochures and catalog pages. This is for that self-priming lawn sprinkling pump. Here's one for these straight centrifugal pumps. If you want, you can get an entire irrigation catalog that's going to have all those pumps in it. Again, just go to the website. You can click on literature and you can order any of those online. So one thing I failed to mention early on with this broadcast is if there were going to be any questions. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds. If anybody's got any questions, go ahead and pop those in. I'd be more than happy to try to answer them. But if I don't hear anything in about 10 seconds, I'm going to assume everybody's satisfied. And so here we go. Time starts now. Any questions?
Yep, we got one. So where could they get those literature pieces? From salesmen? You can find them online?
Okay, so yeah, I'm going to repeat this because the question come in, you know, where can you get these literature pieces? If you go on to the F&W website, that's flintandwalling.com, in the top left-hand corner, you'll see what looks like, I call it a hamburger, right? It's a menu tab. It's got 3 lines. Click on that. And then when you click down to product support, you're going to find the tab for product literature. You can scroll through all those pieces and order whatever you want. But that's where you can find that. Get a hold of your salesman. Let them do that work for you. Or call in here. There's no shortage of ways that we can get this in your hands. So any other questions?
Nope, that's all we got.
That's all we got. All right, folks. Appreciate you joining me today. And I really look forward to these other future broadcasts. So stay tuned in. Take that coffee, and you know, if you're on your way to the office, on your way to a job site, or if you're tuned in wherever, just go ahead and have it, right? Cheers. Talk to you later.